Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Joshua Moehling again, and this time about A Long Time Gone. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me back.
Yes, absolutely. I told Josh before we started recording, I don't know if I can go back to the Great Lakes area. Everybody's killing everybody. What's up with that? I thought these were supposed to be a sleepy little village, Josh. What happened?
Yeah, and I told you in Minnesota, you're either a murderer or a crime writer. Yeah, two choices.
All right, I'll take the crime writer for sure. So will you give the audience an overview of A Long Time Gone?
Yeah, so this is the third book in a series. It's the main character is Ben Packard. I've been told it works as a standalone. I tried to write it such that if you haven't read the first two books, that you can come in here if you want to. This book, Packard is in a bad spot in this book. Things are just really bad for him at work. And without kind of spoiling the end of the second book, things are not going well for him at work. And then to make matters worse, he's involved in a police shooting because somebody brings a gun to the courthouse where he's working and opens fire on the people standing there. And so, the procedure is that you're on administrative leave after you're involved in a shooting like that. And so he's got time on his hands to look into the case involving his brother who disappeared 30 years ago. They assume that he drowned in the lake. They found a snowmobile in the lake, but they never found his body. And Packard and his family have never really been happy with that answer. And he got some kind of interesting news at the end of the second book, and now he's got time to pursue it. And so that's what he's kind of doing at the beginning of this book. But then along the way, he also comes across another crime that's kind of connected to the disappearance of his brother, kind of connected to his family a little bit. And it involves the death of a local woman that the more Packard looks into it, the less he believes it got the attention that it deserved. And so that sends him off on another path, trying to find out what happened to this woman.
So let's unpack a little bit of that. So Ben is a great deputy, and he's thorough, and he has a great eye for detail, and that's something that I really enjoyed because he's also not a braggart. Ben's just sure of himself as far as as his work goes, and so that is something that as this book unfolds that we see with Louise Larson, that she has died. And Ben is a little unsettled with just sort of the dismissal of, she had a boo-boo, she had an accident or whatever. Yeah. And it's one of those things that, you root for Ben. I think I said this in the last time I chatted with you. Ben is somebody you really do want to root for because he's your buddy. He's somebody you're going to stop and have a beer with or have a chat with. He's the friendly officer, that we all hope if we have to encounter a police officer that we get one that's friendly. And I think that's a lot to your credit as an author, what you've created with Ben. He's not his brother disappearing affects him as does his family. And I'm sorry, I'm probably hijacking it. You're supposed to be telling all this good stuff. But I do love Ben. I think there's something about him that I find to be so interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. He's very much kind of probably the idealized vision of a law enforcement person. And it's hard to write about law enforcement in Minnesota and not talk about George Floyd or Minnesota is still struggling with what we want from our law enforcement in the wake of George Floyd being killed. And I know policing is very fraught, and I know it's got kind of a fraught history. So in a lot of ways, Ben Packard is very much maybe an idealized vision for what law enforcement could look like. Yeah, go ahead.
And that's one of the things that I really do like about him. Honestly, I can't imagine, to be very serious about our current situation with police, I can't imagine that's an easy job to begin with. Right. If someone takes out a gun and shoots at you, your life is a little different than if you were sitting home playing tiddlywinks. So, I mean, I do understand that there are times when the police are caught in the crosshairs of something really, really bad. But I also know that for some humans, given a gun and a badge, they become a very different person because all of a sudden they have this big shield that's going to protect them. And
Right.
some bad apples think they can do anything. So
Yeah.
giving us someone that is, has his own issues, but isn't flawed is a good read for me because I read all kinds. I
Yeah.
read the bad police officer, the good police officer, the crooked one. So, I like the fact that Ben's sort of straightforward and straight shooting.
Yeah, he really struggles with that in this book because he is involved. The very first 10 pages, he's involved with shooting somebody. He takes somebody's life who brought a gun to the courthouse and is shooting at the people, and he's struggling with that impression of himself and that impression contributing to that kind of storyline about what police do. They just show up with guns and open fire, and he's really struggling with that mentally and personally in his role in kind of adding to that narrative, which is really the last thing that he wants to do.
Well, and I think you did, because you mentioned George Floyd, and I think you did such a great job in incorporating that sort of on a periphery story, but how it affects Ben and what he wants to be perceived as. And I think you did such a great job with that because Ben has a conscience to him, which is a lovely thing.
Yeah. I kind of ignored it in the first two books, and I really struggled with when and how to bring it in. The first book was already written and was on submission when George Floyd was killed in 2020. And then the second book, I just didn't really see a place to bring it in. But I was like, it gets harder to ignore that when you're writing about law enforcement in Minnesota.
That's right. And of course, you give Ben has such a unique history with a family. When your brother goes missing and there's no definitive answer or no body, B-O-D-Y, not nobody, but no one particular body. All of a sudden, that gives a different complexity to what a family dynamic would be. And I will tell you, Pam, Ben's mother, made me laugh out loud in several places. I'm like, oh dear God in heaven above, of all the mothers to give Ben, you give him Pam.
Yeah.
How much fun was Pam?
Pam was a blast. When I was writing it, I knew that I didn't really have a super strong vision for her in the beginning. And I was like, in the beginning, she's like, I'm coming to town. And he tells her, no, there's too much going on. Don't come. And she's like, I'm coming. And then I was like, what is it like when Ben's mom shows up? And I knew she just had to be the opposite of him in every way imaginable. He's so straight-laced. He's so uptight. And I was like, his mom is going to be the opposite. And his mom is going to have dealt with, this terrible thing that happened to their family in a totally different way than he would have dealt with it. And a couple of years ago, we were on vacation in Sedona, my husband and I, and we went hiking up these mountains. And there was these three older women, older than me anyway, and they were just kind of huffing it up this mountain. And they had these backpacks on, and they had all this stuff and these big long kind of capes and gray hair, and they got ahead of us. And then we eventually met up with them on kind of like this plateau, and they'd laid all this stuff out like a blanket. And there was like a framed photo of somebody, and there were crystals, and they were lighting sage, and there was a tambourine, and they had this whole thing going on. And I was like, that's Ben Packard's mom right there.
Ben Packard, who spends his whole life trying to have a low profile, then his mother comes to town bursting at the seams. And it's so fun. Her interaction with the character Anne just really had me in stitches, so Lord, I don't really want to compare myself to Pam because Pam's a mess in this book, but a loving and lovely mess. But I will say that there have been times in my life where, people want to take the high road. They want it to be very official. And I'm like, let's just cut right through the bush, get right to the heart of the matter. So in a way, I can be a little bit like Pam, a little bit of a bull in a china shop. Let's just get to the punchline here. I don't want to talk about it too long. But she's able to share with Ben some things that I know as humans we we sometimes remember history differently than it actually happened. And I love the fact that with Pam, you sort of stretched out this thing in Ben's mind. He has this entire story and scenario set up on his mind. And Pam gently and lovingly says, well, wait, there might be some other side. There may be other tentacles to look at.
Yeah. Yeah. Ben kind of considers himself the authority on what happened to his brother. He thinks nobody knows more or remembers more. He feels he's kind of got a special role in this because he's the last person who saw his brother alive. And then, you know, one of the things they confront in this book is that how they've stopped talking about what happened to his brother. And it's kind of, at a certain point, it became kind of a source of shame for him. And, you know, it's been a long time. And so he has the realization now that they're talking about it again. And his mom helps him realize that he doesn't remember everything exactly the way it happened. And there are gaps in his knowledge of what happened. And, you know, there were reasons behind why the family dealt with it the way they did. And everybody, you know, they had to make the best decision they knew how to make in the moment. And, you know, 30 years on, would they make the same decision? Maybe not, but.
Or they might make the exact, or they make the exact same decision.
Yeah.
I think that if you've led a charmed life and you didn't have trauma growing up, trauma is something that really changes the dynamic of each person's life that experiences the trauma, and especially like a family unit.
Yeah.
I know I knew this family that had a severely disabled child was the oldest, and the next two didn't have a severe disability. Mm-hmm. And it was difficult for the second and third child because they were always in the shadow of the oldest child. The parents had to pay attention to the oldest child. It was imperative. It wasn't an option.
Right.
But then at some point, I know the parents sort of pulled back and said, we have to change this scenario because the second and third child are really beginning to suffer. Yeah. And I think that things like trauma and things that you cannot control can eat a family alive. And it's hard to know which way you would go with it.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this was like a bomb going off in this family, and they, you know, it cost his parents their marriage. The kids are all kind of affected by it in different ways. Packard had the kind of, I don't know if you want to call it trauma, but the added trauma of being gay and realizing that he's gay at the exact same time and dealing with all those kind of scary emotions and realizations on top of it. And so, yeah, it was a lot for everybody to deal with.
Yes. And I think when there's trauma, it always takes center stage. And then whatever is on the sides or the periphery takes second banana.
Yeah.
spot. So in this, you also, in Long Time Gone, you sort of skewer up politics a little bit as well. And it's not necessarily a political statement, but so living here in Los Angeles, I did see some of the same things. I know that the lakefront properties around a lot of lakes in Minnesota are now so expensive that the average person doesn't build a lakeside cabin anymore because there are too many Mac mansions. So I did appreciate you dealing with that and dealing with it really rather directly in the fact that, you know, Ben probably wouldn't be able to buy Louise Larson's house even if he wanted to, because it's just too darned expensive.
Yeah, there's a whole kind of cabin culture here in Minnesota, and I'm sure it's in other states too, where, you know, if you can afford a second home, and I think a lot more people could afford them a long time ago than they can now. But it's part of the kind of the culture in Minnesota here, where you leave the city on the weekend and go up to the cabin, mm-hmm. and that's where you spend the holidays. And that it's gotten more expensive to have a home like that. It's a lot of families kind of have those homes, but the kids aren't interested in them when they grow up. They don't want the responsibility or the cost to maintain them. And then real estate values just go through the roof. And then it kind of creates this dynamic in some of these rural areas where tons of people with money own all the good property and everybody else is kind of living on the fringes, catering to them.
Yeah, I find it's that way in a lot of big cities. You know, here, lots of people used to go out to Palm Springs or whatever for the weekend. Lots of us still go to Palm Springs, but those condos that used to be $70,000 and $80,000 10 years ago are now $500,000. Yeah. And they're no different now than they were 10 years ago, except they're 10 years older
Yeah.
and 7 times the original price, and it's just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, but they're just not shipping me the cash to my place like they used to. And I read so many murder mysteries, I'm like, hell, should I get me a sideline? But I think probably not. I might be the one to get shot, and I wouldn't like that. So are you working on the next Ben? Will there be a number 4?
There is a number 4. I'm about 3,000 words from the end of the first draft.
Okay.
I promised it to my editor at the end of this month, so I have 4 more days.
Oh, the end of January. I see. Well,
Yeah.
that's here.
It's a steaming pile of crap right now, but
oh, it's just 4,000 or 5,000 words a day. Don't worry about it, Josh. Knock it out. You can get up early. I'd say, do you want me to call you, but you're ahead of me, so that won't really work so well.
I've only got about 3,000 or 4,000 words left, so I
okay.
bang out 1,000 words a day, no problem.
All right, yeah, that's not.
So I'm kind of downhill from here, so I know where it's going. But
all right. So, anything you want to tell us about where book 4 is going?
I shouldn't say too much about book 4 right now. There were some questions at the back of book 3. They asked me what happens in book 4, and I said something about a dark storm blows in a new danger or something like that. So it opens with a storm. I'll leave it at that.
I love it. I like it. And Frank will make a reappearance in book 4, right?
Frank is always around. I feel like I don't give Frank the attention that he deserves, because I know everybody loves Frank, but that was one of the things I was like, if I give this guy a dog, he can't just disappear for a week at a time and leave the dog unattended. And when you've got a dog, when you own a dog in the novel, you've got to keep the dog a little bit in the forefront.
That's right, because Frank has to be walked and he has to be fed, or else Frank will cause holy hell. Oh, that's so wonderful. Again, the book is called A Long Time Gone. It's by Joshua Moehling. Josh, do you have a website or social media you'd like to share?
My website is joshuamoehling.com. I have a very sporadic newsletter that comes out that you could sign up for. And then I'm mostly on Instagram and Facebook at jmoehling.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This was so wonderful, and I'm already looking forward to book 4. I did tell a friend of mine that the sad thing about reading your work is when I finish the book, I'm already depressed because I have to wait for the next one. This was so wonderful and just as magical as the first 2. So thank you so much. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.